Okay, hello. Today I'm going to be reading chapter 2 from The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. Chapter 2, House and Universe. Quand les crimes de notre ciel se rejoindront, ma maison aura un toit. When the peaks of our sky come together, my house will have a roof. In the preceding chapter, I pointed out that it was reasonable to say we read a house or read a room, since both room and house are psychological diagrams that guide writers and poets in their analysis of intimacy. We shall now read slowly several houses and rooms written by great writers. 1. Although at heart a city man, Baudelaire sensed the increased intimacy of a house when it is besieged by winter. In Les Paradis Artificiels, he speaks of Thomas de Quincey's joy when, a prisoner of winter, he read Kant with the help of the idealism furnished by opium. The scene takes place in a cottage in Wales. Une jolie habitation ne rend pas rêveur plus poétique, et l'hiver n'augmentait-il pas la puissance de l'habitation? Les banques étaient assis au fond d'une petite vallée formée de montagnes suffisamment hautes. Il était comme émailloté d'arbustes. Isn't it true that a pleasant house makes winter more poetic? And does not winter add to the poetry of a house? The white cottage sat at the end of a little valley, shut in by rather high mountains, and it seemed to be swathed in shrubs. I have underlined the words in this short sentence that belong to the imagination of repose. And what a quiet setting for an opium eater, reading Kant in the combined solitudes of dream and thought. As for the passage Baudelaire devoted to it, no doubt we can read it the way we can read any easy passage. A literary critic might even be surprised by the naturalness with which this great poet has used commonplace images. But if, while reading this oversimplified passage, we accept the daydreams of repose it suggests, if we pause over the underlined words, it soon brings tranquility to body and soul. We feel that we are living in the protective center of the house in the valley. We too are swathed in the blanket of winter, and we feel warm because it is cold out of doors. Further on in this deep winter, artificial paradise, Baudelaire declares that dreamers like a severe winter. Every year, they ask the sky to send down as much snow, hail, and frost as it can contain. What they really need are Canadian or Russian winters. Their own nests will be all the warmer, all the downier, all the better beloved. Like Edgar Allan Poe, a great dreamer of curtains, Baudelaire, in order to protect the winter girt house from cold, added, heavy draperies that hung down to the floor. Behind dark curtains, snow seems to be whiter. Indeed, everything comes alive when contradictions accumulate. Here, Baudelaire has furnished us with a centered picture that leads to the heart of a dream, which we can then take over for ourselves. No doubt we shall give it certain personal features, such as peopling Thomas de Quincey's cottage with persons from our own past. In this way, we receive the benefits of this evocation without its exaggerations. Our most personal recollections can come and live here, and through some indefinable current of sympathy, Baudelaire's description has ceased to be commonplace. But it is always like that. Well determined centers of reverie are means of communication between men who dream as surely as well defined concepts are means of communication between men who think. In Curiosités Esthétiques, Baudelaire also speaks of a canvas by Lavalier, which shows a thatched cottage on the edge of a wood. In winter, the sad season. Certain of the effects that Lavalier often got, Baudelaire wrote, seem to me to constitute the very essence of winter happiness. A reminder of winter strengthens the happiness of inhabiting. In the reign of the imagination alone, a reminder of winter increases the house's value as a place to live in. If I were asked to make an expert evaluation of the wonderism in De Quincey's cottage, as relived by Baudelaire, I should say that there lingers about it the insipid odor of opium, an atmosphere of drowsiness. But we are told nothing about the strength of the walls or the fortitude of the roof. The house puts up no struggle. It is as though Baudelaire knew of nothing to shut himself in with but curtains. This absence of struggle is often the case of the winter houses in literature. The dialectics of the house and the universe are too simple, and snow, especially, reduces the exterior world to nothing rather too easily. It gives a single color to the entire universe, which, with the one word, snow, is both expressed and nullified for those who have found shelter. In Les Deserts de l'amour, Rimbaud himself said, cette tête comme une note d'hiver avec un nez trop froid, le monde décidément. It was like a winter's night with snow to stifle the world for certain. In any case, outside the occupied house, the winter cosmos is a simplified cosmos. It is a non house in the same way that metaphysicians speak of a non I. And between the house and the non house, it is easy to establish all sorts of contradictions. Inside the house, everything may be differentiated and multiplied. The house derives reserves and refinements of intimacy from winter, while in the outside world, snow covers all tracks, blurs the roads, muffles every sound, conceals all colors. As a result of this universal whiteness, we feel a form of cosmic negation and action. The dreamer of houses knows and senses this, and because of the diminished entity of the outside world, experiences all the qualities of intimacy with increased intensity. 2. Winter is by far the oldest of the seasons. Not only does it confer age upon our memories, taking us back to a remote past, but on snowy days, the house too is old. It is as though it were living in the past of centuries gone by. This feeling is described by Bachelard in a passage that presents winter in all its hostility. Those were evenings when, in old houses exposed to snow and icy winds, the great stories, the beautiful legends that men hand down to one another take on concrete meaning and, for those who delve into them, become immediately applicable. And thus it was perhaps that one of our ancestors who lay dying in the year 1000 should have come to believe in the end of the world. For here the stories that were told were not the fireside fairy tales recounted by old women. They were stories about men, stories that reflect upon forces and signs. During these winters, Bachelard writes elsewhere, it seems to me that under the hood of the great fireplace, the old legends must have been much older than they are today. Must have been much older than they are today. What they really had was the immemorial quality of the tragic cataclysms that can presage the end of the world. What they really had was the immemorial quality of the tragic cataclysms that can presage the end of the world. Recalling these evenings during the dramatic winters in his father's house, Bachelard writes, when our companions left us, their feet deep in snow and their faces in the teeth of the blizzard, it seemed to me that they were going very far away to unknown owl and wolf infested lands. I was tempted to call after them, as people did in my early history books, may God help you. And what a striking thing it is that a mere image of the old homestead in the snowdrifts should be able to integrate images of the year 1000 in the mind of a child. 3. We come now to a case which is more complex and may even appear to be paradoxical. It is taken from a passage in Rilke's correspondence. Contrary to the general thesis I set forth in the preceding chapter, for Rilke, storms are particularly aggressive in cities where heavens higher to is most clearly manifested. In the country, apparently, hurricanes are less hostile to us. From my point of view, this is a paradox of cosmic origin, but needless to say, the Rilke fragment is very fine. It lends itself to interesting comment. Here is what Rilke wrote to his fair musician. Do you know that when I am in this city, I am frightened by hurricanes at night? It is as though in their elemental pride, they did not see us. They do see a lonely house the country, they take it in their powerful arms, and in that way, they inure it. And when you are there, you would like to be out of doors in a roaring garden, or at least stand at the window and applaud the infuriated old trees that twist and turn as though possessed by the spirits of the prophets. Photographically speaking, these lines of Rilke seem to me to be a negative of the house, the reverse of the function of inhabiting. When the storm rages and lashes the trees in the shelter of the house, Rilke would like to be out of doors, not through any desire to enjoy the wind and the rain, but in order to pursue his own reverie. So he shares, we feel, the anger reflex of the tree attacked by the anger of the wind. But he does not share the house's resistance. He puts his trust in the wisdom of the storm, in the clear vision of the lightning, and in all the elements which, even in their rage, see the abodes of men and agree to spare them. But this negative of an image is nonetheless revealing, for it gives evidence of a dynamism in combat that is cosmic in its proportions. Rilke has furnished many proofs, to which we shall often refer, of his cognizance of the drama that attaches to the dwellings of men, at whatever dialectical pole the dreamer stands, whether in the house or in the universe. The dialectics become dynamic. House and space are not merely two juxtaposed elements of space, nor of the imagination. They awaken daydreams in each other that are opposed. Rilke is ready to concede that the old house is inured by its trials. The house capitalizes its victories over the hurricanes. And since in all research concerning the imagination, we must leave the realm of facts behind, we know perfectly that we feel calmer and more confident when in the old home, in the house we were born in, than we do in the houses on streets where we have only lived as transients. 4. Contrary to the negative we have just been considering, let us now take the example of a positive that constitutes total adherence to the drama of the house besieged by storms. In Henry Bosco's Malicroix, the house is called La Reduce. La Reduce. It is built on an island in the Camargue region, not far from the great Rhone River. It is a humble house and appears to lack resistance. We shall see what fortitude it possessed. The author takes many pages to prepare us for the storm that is brewing. The poetic weather forecast goes to the very source from whence the sound and the movement are to come. With what art, to begin with, he achieves absolute silence. The immensity of these silent stretches of space. There is nothing like silence to suggest a sense of unlimited space. Sounds lend color to space and confer a sort of sound body upon it. But absence of sound leaves it quite pure, and in the silence we are boundless. It took complete hold of me, and for several moments I was overwhelmed by the grandeur of this shadowy piece. It asserted itself like a person. It asserted itself like a person. This piece had a body. It was caught up in the night, made of night, a real, emotionless body. In this vast prose poem, we come upon passages that contain the same progression of sounds and fears as is to be found in certain stanzas of Victor Hugo's Legends. Only here the author takes the time to show the narrowing of the space at the center of which the house is to live like an anguished heart. A kind of cosmic anguish precedes the storm. Then the wind starts to howl at the top of its lungs. Soon the entire menagerie of the hurricane lifts its voice. If one had the leisure to analyze the dynamics of storms, what a bestiary of the wind could be found, not only in these pages, but throughout Bosco's work. For this author knows instinctively that all aggression, whether it come from man or from the world, is of animal origin. However subtle, however indirect, hidden or contrived a human act of aggression may be, it reveals an origin that is unredeemed. In the tiniest of hatreds, there is a little live animal filament. And the poet psychologist, or the psychologist poet, if such a one exists, cannot go wrong in marking the different types of aggression with an animal cry. It is also a terrible trait of men that they should be incapable of understanding the forces of the universe intuitively, otherwise than in terms of a psychology of wrath. And faced with this pact, which gradually breaks loose, the house becomes the real being of a pure humanity which defends itself without ever being responsible for an attack. La redouce is man's resistance. It is human virtue, man's grandeur. Here is the passage that describes the house's human resistance at the height of the storm. The house was fighting gallantly. At first, it gave voice to its complaints. The most awful gusts were attacking it from every side at once, with evident hatred, and such howls of rage that at times I trembled with fear. But it stood firm from the very beginning of the storm. Snarling winds had been taking the roof to task, trying to pull it off, to break its back, tear it into shreds, suck it off. But it only hunched over further and clung to the old rafters. Then other winds rushing along close to the ground, charged against the wall. Everything swayed under the shock of this blow, but the flexible house stood up to the beast. No doubt it was holding firmly to the soil of the island by means of the unbreakable roots from which its thin walls of mud-coated reeds and planks drew their supernatural strength. Though the shutters and doors were salted, though huge threats were proffered, and there was loud bubbling in the chimney, It was of no avail. The already human being in whom I had sought shelter for my body yielded nothing to the storm. The house clung close to me like a she-wolf, and at times I could smell her odor penetrating maternally to my very heart. That night she was really my mother. She was all I had to keep and sustain me. We were alone. Discussing maternity in my book, et les Reveries du Repos, I quoted the following magnificent lines by Melos, in which the mother image and the house image are united. Je dis m'aimer, et c'est à vous que je pensais, ô maison. Maison des bouts et obscurs de mon enfance. I say, mother, and my thoughts are of you, O house, house of the lovely dark summers of my childhood. Melancholy. It was imperative to find a similar image to express the deep gratitude of the inhabitant of La Reduce. Here, however, the image does not come from a nostalgia for childhood, but is given in its actuality of protection. Here, too, in addition to community of affection, there is community of forces, the concentrated courage and resistance of both house and man. And what an image of concentrated being we are given with this house that clings to its inhabitant and becomes the cell of a body with its walls close together. The refuge shrinks in size, and with its protective qualities increased, it grows outwardly stronger. From having been a refuge, it has become a redoubt. The thatched cottage becomes a fortified castle for the recluse who must learn to conquer fear within its walls. Such a dwelling has an educative value, for in this passage of Bosco's book there is a sort of dovetailing of reserves of strength with the inner fortresses of courage. In a house that has become, for the imagination, the very heart of a cyclone, we have to go beyond the mere impressions of consolation that we should feel in any shelter. We have to participate in the dramatic cosmic events sustained by the combatant house. The combatant house. But the real drama of Malicroix is an ordeal by solitude. The inhabitant of La Reduce must dominate solitude in a house on an island where there is no village. He must attain to the dignity of solitude that had been achieved by one of his ancestors who had become a man of solitude as a result of a deep tragedy in his life. He must live alone in a cosmos which is not that of his childhood. This man who comes of gentle, happy people must cultivate courage in order to confront a world that is harsh, indignant, and cold. The isolated house furnishes him with strong images, that is, with counsels of resistance. And so, faced with the bestial hostility of the storm and the hurricane, the house's virtues of protection and resistance are transposed into human virtues. The house acquires the physical and moral energy of a human body. It braces itself to receive the downpour. It girds its loins. When forced to do so, it bends with the blast, confident that it will right itself again in time while continuing to deny any temporary defeats. Such a house as this invites mankind to heroism of cosmic proportions. It is an instrument with which to confront the cosmos and the metaphysical systems according to which man is cast into the world. Might meditate concretely upon the house that it is cast into the hurricane, might meditate concretely upon the house that is cast into the hurricane, define the anger of heaven itself. Come what may, the house helps us to say, I will be an inhabitant of the world in spite of the world. The problem is not only one of being, it is also a problem of energy and consequently of counter energy. In this dynamic reverie between house and universe, we are far removed from any reference to simple geometrical forms. A house that has been experienced is not an inert box. Inhabited space transcends geometrical space. But can this transposition of the being of a house into human values be considered as an activity of metaphor? Is not this merely a matter of linguistic imagery? As metaphors, a literary critic would certainly find them exaggerated. On the other hand, a positivist psychologist would immediately reduce this language to the psychological reality of the fear felt by a man immured in his solitude from far from all human assistance. A positivist psychologist would immediately reduce this language to the psychological reality of the fear felt by a man immured in his solitude, far from all human assistance. But phenomenology of the imagination cannot be content with a reduction which would make the image a subordinate means of expression. It demands, on the contrary, that images be lived directly, that they be taken as sudden events in life. When the image is new, the world is new. And in reading applied to life, all passivity disappears if we try to become aware of the creative acts of the poet expressing the world, a world that becomes accessible to our daydreaming. In Bosco's Malicroix, the world influences solitary man more than the characters are able to do. Indeed, if the many prose poems the book contains were to be deleted, all that remained would be the story of a legacy and a duel between the notary and the heir. But much is to be gained for a psychologist of the imagination if to social he adds cosmic reading. He comes to realize that the cosmos molds mankind, that it can transform a man of the hills into a man of islands and rivers, and that the house remodels man. With the house that has been experienced by a poet, we come to a delicate point in anthropocosmology. The house, then, really is an instrument of topoanalysis. It is even a efficacious instrument for the very reason that it is hard to use. In short, discussion of our thesis takes place on ground that is unfavorable to us. For, in point of fact, a house is first and foremost a geometrical object, first and foremost a geometrical object, one which we are tempted to analyze rationally. Its prime reality is visible and tangible, made of well hewn solids and well fitted frameworks. It is dominated by straight lines and plumb line, the plumb line having marked it with its disciple balance. For, in point of fact, a house is first and foremost a geometrical object, one which we are tempted to analyze rationally. Its prime reality is visible and tangible, made of well hewn solids and well fitted framework. It is dominated by straight lines, the plumb line having marked it with its discipline and balance. A geometrical object of this kind ought to resist metaphors that welcome the human body and the human soul, but transposition to the human plane takes place immediately whenever a house is considered as space for cheer and intimacy, space that is supposed to condense and defend intimacy, independent of all rationality. The dream world beckons, and as I read and reread Malicroix, to quote Pierre-Jean Jouve, I hear the iron hooves of dream on the roof of La Reduce. But the complex of reality and dream is never definitively resolved. The house itself, when it starts to live humanly, does not lose all its objectivity. We shall therefore have to examine more closely how houses of the past appear in dream geometry, for these are the houses in which we are going to recapture the intimacy of the past in our daydreams. We shall have to apply ourselves increasingly to study how, by means of the house, the warm substance of intimacy resumes its form, the same form that it had when it enclosed original warmth. Et travaillant sans maison, je sens sa rusée, très de vent des sens à l'esprit. And the old house, I feel its rousette warmth comes from the senses to the mind. 5. First of all, these old houses can be drawn. We can make a representation that has all the characteristics of a copy. An objective drawing of this kind, independent of all daydreaming, is a forceful, reliable document that leaves its mark on a biography. But let this exteriorist representation manifest an art of drawing or a talent for representation, and it becomes insistent, inviting. Merely to judge it as a good, well executed likeness lends to contemplation and daydreaming. Daydreams return to inhabit an exact drawing, and no dreamer ever remains indifferent for long to a picture of a house. Long before the time when I began to read poetry every day, I had often said to myself that I should like to live in a house such as one sees in old prints. I was most attracted by the bold outlines of the houses in woodcuts, which, it seemed to me, demanded simplicity. Through them, my daydreams inhabited the essential house, These naive daydreams, which I thought were my own, were a source of astonishment to me when I found traces of them in my reading. In 1913, André Lafont had written Je rêvis dans logins maison bassin à la française, haute 3 degrés ou 16 places et le 10. Logis pouvait être secret de l'air de antique estampé qui m'en met où j'ai rentré parfois mes soirs pas oubliés. Les jours gris étaient la pluie. I dream of a low house with high windows, 3 worn steps, smooth and green. A poor secret house, as in an old print, that only lives in me, where sometimes I return to sit down and forget the gray day and the rain. A poor secret house, as in an old print, that only lives in me, where sometimes I return to sit down and forget the gray day and the rain. André Lafont wrote many other poems under the sign of the poor house. In his literary prints, the house welcomes the reader like a host. A bit more, and he would be ready to seize the chisel and engrave his own reading. Certain types of prints end by specifying types of houses. Annie Dufil wrote Je suis dans une maison d'estampes japonaises, le soleil partout, quand tu es transparent, quand tu es transparent. I am in a house in a Japanese print. The sun is everywhere, for everything is transparent. There exist sunny houses in which, at all seasons, it is summer. Houses that are all windows. And is not the poet who wrote the following also an inhabitant of prints? Qui n'est pas au fond de son creux, un sombre château de les nus, à l'instar des gens du passé, un costume et son monde privé, paupières un grand château hanté. Who has not deep in his heart a dark castle of Elsinore? In the manner of men of the past, we build within ourselves stone on stone a vast haunted castle. And so I am cheered by the pictures I find in my reading. I go to live in the literary prints poets offer me. The more simple the engraved house, the more it fires my imagination as an inhabitant. It does not remain a mere representation. Its lines have force, and as a shelter, it is fortifying. It asks to be lived in simply with all the security that simplicity gives. The print house awakens a feeling for the hut in me, and through it I re experience the penetrating gaze of the little window. But see now what has happened. When I speak the image sincerely, I suddenly feel a need to underline. And what is underlining but engraving while we write? 6. Sometimes the house grows and spreads so that, in order to live in it, greater elasticity of daydreaming, a daydream that is less clearly outlined, are needed. My house writes George Spiridaki, is diaphanous, but it is not of glass. It is more of the nature of vapor. Its walls contract and expand as I desire. At times I draw them close about me like protective armor, but at others I let the walls of my house blossom out in their own space, which is infinitely extensible. Spiridaki's house breathes. First, it is a coat of armor, then it extends at infinitum, which amounts to saying that we live in it in alternate security and adventure. It is both cell and whirl. Here, geometry is transcended. To give unreality to an image attached to a strong reality is in the spirit of poetry. These lines by Rene Casellas speaks to us of this expansion if we can inhabit his images. The following was written in the heart of Provence, a country of sharp contours. The undiscoverable house where this lava flower blows, where this lava flower blows, where storms and exhausting bliss are born. When will my search for it cease? Symmetry abolished to serve as fodder for the winds. I should like my house to be similar to that of the ocean wind, all quivering with gills. Thus, an immense cosmic house is a potential of every dream house. Winds radiate from its center and gulls fly from its windows. A house that is as dynamic as this allows the poet to inhabit the universe. Or to put it differently, the universe comes to inhabit his house. Occasionally, in a moment of repose, the poet returns to the center of his abode. Tout respirer à nouveau, la neppe est blanche. Everything breathes again. The tablecloth is white. But the tablecloth is white. Let's see. Everything breathes again. The tablecloth is white. Everything breathes again. Tout respirer à nouveau, la nappe est blanche. Everything breathes again. The tablecloth is white. This bit of whiteness, this tablecloth, suffices to anchor the house to its center. The literary houses described by Georges Spiridaki and René Casellas are immense dwellings, the walls of which are on vacation. There are moments when it is a salutary thing to go and live in them as a treatment for claustrophobia. The image of these houses that integrate the wind aspire to the lightness of air and bear on the tree of their impossible growth a nest all ready to fly away, may perhaps be rejected by a positive, realistic mind, but it is of value for a general thesis on the imagination because, without the poet's knowing it, apparently, it is touched by the attraction attraction of opposites, which lends dynamism to the great archetypes. In an article in the Eranos yearbook, Heinrich Neumann shows that all strongly terrestrial beings, and a house is strongly terrestrial, are nevertheless subject to the attractions of an aerial celestial world. The well rooted house likes to have a branch that is sensitive to the wind, or an attic that can hear the rustle of the leaves. The poet who wrote Escalier des Arbres on y monte, on the stairs of the trees we mount, was certainly thinking of an attic. If we compose a poem about a house, it frequently happens that the most flagrant contradictions come to wake us from our doldrums of concepts, as philosophers would say, and free us from our utilitarian geometrical notions. In this fragment by René Cazelliès, solidity is achieved by an imaginary dialectics. We inhale in it the impossible odor of lava. Here, granite has wings. Conversely, the sudden wind is as rigid as a girder. The house conquers its share of the sky. It has the entire sky for its terrace. But my commentary is becoming too precise concerning the different characteristics of the house. It is inclined to be hospitable to fragmentary dialectics, and if I were to pursue it, I should destroy the unity of the archetype. However, this is always the case. It is better to leave the ambivalences of the archetypes wrapped in their dominant quality. This is why a poet will always be more suggestive than a philosopher. It is precisely his right to be suggestive, pursuing the dynamism that belongs to suggestion. Then the reader can go further, even too far. In reading and rereading René Cazelliès' poem, once we have accepted the burst of the image, we know that we can reside not only in the topmost heights of the house, but in a super height. There are many images with which I like to make super height experiments. The image of the house in the solid representation is folded lengthwise. When the poet unfolds it and spreads it out, it presents a very pure phenomenological aspect. Consciousness becomes uplifted in contact with an image that ordinarily is in repose. The image is no longer descriptive, but resolutely inspirational. It is a strange situation. The space we love is unwilling to remain permanently enclosed. It deploys and appears to move elsewhere without difficulty, into other times and on different planes of dream and memory. Is there a reader who would fail to take advantage of the ubiquity of a poem like this one? On me s'endresser au cours ma cathédrale de silence. Chaque matin, après un veillée, et chaque soir abandonné, on me sent couverté doué, overté en rang de ma jeunesse. A house that stands in my heart, my cathedral of silence. every morning recaptured in dream, every evening abandoned, a house covered with dawn, open to the winds of my youth. This house, as I see it, is a sort of airy structure that moves about on the breath of time. It really is open to the wind of another time. It seems as though it could greet us every day of our lives in order to give us confidence in life. In my daydreaming, I associate these lines by Jean Malicroix with the passage in which René's call dreams in a room that grew buoyant and little by little expanded into the vast stretches of travel. If the Creator listened to poets, he would create a flying turtle that would carry off into the blue the great safeguards of earth. If further proof of these weightless houses were needed, there is a poem by Louis Gilloy entitled Maison des Vents, Wind House, in which the poet dreams as follows. En temps, j'étais construit en maison. À chaque souvenir, j'ai transporté des spirales du rivage en sommant des tesseuses et je voyais. Je me trouvais par les saisons, 33 chants, remet la mer dans ce solemn fond des nuages, auxquels qui mêlent ses promesses. Mais sans devant, des murs conflets effaçants. Long did I build you, O house. With each memory I carried stones from the bank to your topmost wall, and I saw your roof mellowed by time, changing as the sea, dancing against a background of clouds with which it mingled its smoke. Wind house, abode that a breath effaced. Some may wonder at this accumulation of examples. For the realist, the matter is settled. None of that holds water. It is nothing but vain, inconsistent poetry, poetry that has lost all touch with reality. For the positivist man, everything that is unreal is alike, the forms being submerged and drowned in unreality. And the only houses that are capable of possessing individuality are real ones. But a dreamer of houses sees them everywhere, and anything can act as a germ to set him dreaming about them. Jean Malicroix has written elsewhere, Cette pavillonne et on me s'enveille, où chacun retrouve la nuit. This peony is an empty house in which each of us recaptures night. The peony encloses a sleeping insect in its red night. Tout calice et timure. Every chalice is a dwelling place. Paviones et pavot paradis taciturnes. Peonies and poppies, silent gardens of paradise, writes Jean Baudelaire in a line that encloses infinity. When we have dreamed as intensely as this in the hollow of a flower, the wall we recall our lives in, the house that is lost and gone, dissolved in the waters of the past, is no ordinary way. It is impossible to read the four lines that follow without entering into a dream that is endless. La chambre mille et trillieux les trois s'auront enduré. La maison s'est mêlée à la mort dans un miroir qui s'éternit. The room is dying, honey and linden, where drawers opened in morning. The house blends with death in a mirror whose luster is dimming. 7. If we go from these images, which are all light and shimmer, to images that insist and force us to remember farther back into our past, we shall have to take lessons from poets for how forcefully they prove to us that the houses that were lost forever continue to live on in us, that they insist in us in order to live again, as though they expected us to give them a supplement of living. How much better we should live in the old house today. How suddenly our memories assume a living possibility of being. We consider the past, and a sort of remorse at not having lived profoundly enough in the old house fills our hearts, comes up from the past, overwhelms us. Rilke expresses this poignant regret in unforgettable lines which we painfully make our own, not so much for their expression as for their dramatic depth of feeling. En nostalgie de lieu que nettement prompte à ces hommes à l'heureux passagers que je retrouverai le rendre de loin les gestes oubliés l'action supplémentaire. Oh, longing for places that were not, cherished enough in that fleeting hour. Oh, longing for places that were not, cherished enough in that fleeting hour. How I long to make good from afar the forgotten gesture, the additional act. Why were we so quickly sated with the happiness of living in the old house? Why did we not prolong those fleeting hours? In that reality, something more than reality was lacking. We did not dream enough in that house. And since it must be recaptured by means of daydreams, liaison is hard to establish. Our memories are encumbered with facts beyond the recollections we continually hark back to. Beyond the recollections we continually hark back to, we should like to relive our suppressed impressions and the dreams that made us believe in happiness. Heureuse j'ai produit mon imagerie partenaire, partenaire. Heureuse j'ai produit mon imagerie partenaire. Where did I lose you, my trampled fantasies? If we have retained an element of dream in our memories, if we have gone beyond merely assembling exact recollections, bit by bit, the house that was lost in the midst of time will appear from out the shadow. We do nothing to reorganize it. With intimacy, it recovers its entity in the mellowness and precision of our inner life. It is as though something fluid had collected our memories, and we ourselves were dissolved in this fluid of the past. Rilke, who experienced this intimacy of fusion, speaks of the fusion of being with the lost house. I never saw this strange dwelling again. Indeed, as I see it now, the way it appeared to my child's eye, it is not a building, but is quite dissolved and distributed inside me. Here one room, there another room, and here a bit of corridor, which, however, does not connect the two rooms, but is conserved in me in fragmentary form. Thus, the whole thing is scattered about inside me, the rooms, the stairs that descended with such ceremonious slowness, others, narrow cages that mounted in a spiral movement, in the darkness of which we advanced like the blood in our veins. Indeed, at times, dreams go back so far into an undefined, dateless past that clear memories of our childhood home appear to be detached from us. Such dreams unsettle our daydreaming, and we reach a point where we begin to doubt that we ever lived where we lived. Our past is situated elsewhere, and both time and place are impregnated with a sense of unreality. It is as though we sojourned in a limbo of being. Poets and dreamers find themselves writing things upon which metaphysicians would do well to meditate. Here, for instance, is a page of concrete metaphysics which, by overlaying our memory of the childhood house with daydreams, leads us to the ill defined, vaguely located areas of being where we are seized with astonishment at being. In his novel, The House of Breath, William Goyen writes that people could come into the world in a place they could not at first even name and had never known before, and that out of a nameless and unknown place they could grow and move around in it until its name they knew and called with love, and call it home, and put roots there and love others there. So songs about it and write poems of yearning for it like a lover. The soil in which chance had sown the human plant was of no importance, and against this background of nothingness, human values grow. Inversely, if beyond memories we pursue our dreams to their very end, in this pre-memory it is as though nothingness caressed and penetrated being, and as though it gently unbound the ties of being. We ask ourselves if what has been was. Have facts really the value that memory gives them? Distant memory only recalls them by giving them a value, a halo of happiness. But let this value be effaced, and the facts cease to exist. Did they ever exist? Something unreal seeps into the reality of the recollections that are on the borderline between our own personal history and an indefinite prehistory, in the exact place where, after us, the childhood home comes to life in us, before us. Goya makes us understand this. It was quite anonymous. It was a place that was lost in the world. Thus, on the threshold of our space, before the era of our own time, we hover between awareness of being and loss of being, and the entire reality of memory becomes spectral. But it would seem that this element of unreality is in dreams, but it would seem that this element of unreality in the dreams of memory affects the dreamer when he or she is faced with the most concrete things, as with the stone house to which he or she returns at night, her thoughts on mundane things. William Goyen understands this unreality of reality. So this is why when often as you come, so this is why when often as you came home to it, down the road in a mist of rain, it seemed as if the house were founded on the most fragile web of breath, and you had blown it. Then you thought it might not exist at all as built by carpenter's hands, nor had ever, and that it was only an idea of breath breathed out by you who, with that same breath that had blown it, could blow it all away. So this is why, when often as you came home to it, down the road in a mist of rain, it seemed as if the house were founded on the most fragile web of breath that you had blown it. Then you thought it might not exist at all as built by carpenter's hands, nor had ever, and that it was only an idea of breath breathed out by you who, with that same breath that had blown it, could blow it all away. One more time. So this is why, when often as you came home to it, down the road in a mist of rain, it seemed as if the house were founded on the most fragile web of breath, and you had blown it. Then you thought it might not exist at all, as built by carpenter's hands, nor had ever, and that it was only an idea of breath, breathed out by you who, with that same breath that had blown it, could blow it all away. In a passage like this, imagination, memory, and perception exchange functions. The image is created through cooperation between real and unreal, with the help of the functions of the real and the unreal. To use the implements of dialectical logic for studying, not this alternative, but this fusion of opposites, would be quite useless, for they would produce the anatomy of a living thing. But if a house is a living value, it must integrate an element of unreality. All values must remain vulnerable, and those that do not are dead. When two strange images meet, two images that are the work of two poets pursuing separate dreams, They apparently strengthen each other. In fact, this convergence of two exceptional images furnishes, as it were, a counter check for phenomenological analysis. The image loses its grandeur, the image loses its gratuitousness. The free play of the imagination ceases to be a form of anarchy. I should like, therefore, to compare Goyen's image in the House of Breath with one that I quoted in my book, Les Travaux et les Rêveries du Repos, and which at the time I was unable to relate to any other. In Les Domaines Publics, Pierre Serreus writes, on me sent où je vais sur une appliant un nom que l'excellence et les muses me renvoyant, une étrange maçon qui s'étend dans ma voix et qui habitait les vents. J'ai l'inventé mes mains dessinant un nuage, un battu de grands cils au-dessous de France. Un brume qui se dissipait et disparaît comme au jus des images. A house where I go alone calling, a name that silence and the walls give back to me. A strange house contained in my voice, inhabited by the wind. I invent it. My hands draw a cloud, a heaven-bound ship above the forests, mist that scatters and disappears as in the play of images. In order to build better this house in the midst and wind, we should need, according to the poet, un vent plus fort et l'encens bleu du coeur et des mains, a more sonorous voice and the blue incense of heart and word. Like the house of breath, the house of wind is and voice. Like the house of breath, the house of wind and voice is a value that hovers on the frontier between reality and unreality. No doubt, a realistic mind will remain well this side of this region. But for the poetry lover who reads with joy and imagination, it is a red letter day when he can hear echoes of the lost house in two registers. The old house, for those who know how to listen, is a sort of geometry of echoes. The voices of the past do not sound the same in the big room as in the little bedchamber, and calls on the stairs have yet another sound. Among the most difficult memories, well beyond any geometry that can be drawn, we must recapture the quality of the light. Then come the sweet smells that linger in the empty rooms, setting an aerial seal on each room in the house of memory. Still farther, it is possible to recover not merely the timbre of voices, the inflections of beloved voices now silent, but also the resonance of each room in the sound house. In this extreme tenuousness of memory, only poets may be expected to furnish us with documents of a subtly psychological nature. 8. Sometimes the house of the future is better built, lighter, and larger than all the houses of the past. so that the image of the dream house is opposed to that of the childhood home. Late in life, with indomitable courage, we continue to say that we are going to do what we have not yet done. We are going to build a house. This dream house may be merely a dream of ownership, the embodiment of everything that is considered convenient, comfortable, healthy, sound, desirable by other people. It must therefore satisfy both pride and reason, two reconcilable terms. If these dreams are realized, they no longer belong in the domain of this study, but in that of the psychology of projects. However, as I have said many times, for me, a project is short range onerism. And while it gives free play to the mind, the soul does not find in it its vital expression. Maybe it is a good thing for us to keep a few dreams of a house that we shall live in later, always later, so much later, in fact, that we shall not have time to achieve it. For a house that was final, one that stood in symmetrical relation to the house we were born in, would lead to thoughts, serious, sad thoughts, and not to dreams. It is better to live in a state of impermanence than in one of finality. The following anecdote contains a certain wisdom. It is told by Cambanon, who has been discussing poetry with the poet Lucis. When we came to this little poems indited to his home, his flower beds, his kitchen garden, his little wood, or his wine cellar, I could not help remarking jokingly that 100 years hence he risked obliging his commentators to rack their brains. He began to laugh and told me that having desired vainly ever since he was young to have a house in the country with a small garden, he had made up his mind at the age of 70 to give them to himself on his own authority as a poet, and without putting his hand in his pocket, he begun by acquiring a house. Then, as the charm of ownership increased, had added the garden, the little wood, etc. None of this existed outside his imagination, but sufficed for these little fancied possessions to take on reality in his eyes. He spoke of them and derived pleasure from them as though they were real. And so powerful was his imagination that I should not be surprised if, on frosty April nights, he did not show signs of anxiety about his Marley vineyards. In this connection, he told me that a decent, honest country fellow, having read in the paper some of his lyrical pieces on the subject of his estate, had written to offer his services as overseer, adding that all he asked was a place to live and whatever wages he might be considered fair. Housed everywhere but nowhere shut in. This is the motto of the dreamer of dwellings. In the last house, as well as in the actual house, the daydream of inhabiting is thwarted. A daydream of elsewhere should be left open, therefore, at all times. An excellent exercise for the function of inhabiting the dream house consists in taking a train trip. Such a voyage unreels a film of houses that are dreamed, accepted, and refused without our ever having been tempted to stop. As we are when motoring, we are sunk deep in daydreaming with all verification healthily forbidden. But lest this manner of travel be merely a gentle mania of mine, I should like to quote the following passage from Perrault's journals of October 31st, 1850. I am wont to think that I could spend my days contentedly in any retired country house that I see, For I see it to advantage now and without encumbrance. I have not yet imported my humdrum thoughts, my prosaic habits into it to mar the landscape. On August 28th, 1861, Thoreau addresses in thought the fortunate owners of the houses he has seen. Give me but the eyes to see the things which you possess. George Sand said that people could be classified according to whether they aspire to live in a cottage or in a palace. But the question is more complex than that. When we live in a manor house, we dream of a cottage, and when we live in a cottage, we dream of a palace. Better still, we all have our cottage moments and our palace moments. We descend to living close to the ground on the floor of a cottage, then would like to dominate the entire horizon from a castle in Spain. And when reading has given us countless inhabited places, we know how to let the dialectics of cottage and manor sound inside us. This was experienced by great poet Saint-Pol, whose book, Fairies and Terreuse, Inner Enchantments, contains two stories that need only be compared to obtain two quite different pictures of Brittany, and indeed two different worlds. From one world to the other, from one dwelling to the other, dreams come and go. The first story is entitled Adieu à la Chemoure, Farewell to the Cottage. And the second, Les Châtelains et les Paysans, Squire and Peasant. The minute they entered the cottage, it opened its heart and soul. At dawn, your freshly whitewashed being opened its arms to us. The children felt that they had entered into the heart of a dove, and we loved the ladder, your stairway, right away. Elsewhere, the poet tells how generously a cottage radiates peasant humanity and fraternity. This dove house was a hospitable ark. One day, however, Saint-Pol left the cottage for the manor house. Before leaving for a life of luxury and pride, according to Theophile, his Franciscan soul lamented, and he lingered a while longer under the lintel of Hoscanvet. Bryant quotes him as follows: One last time, O cottage, let me kiss your humble walls, even in their shadow, which is the color of my woe. The Camaret Manor, which became Saint-Pol's home, is undoubtedly a poetic creation. In every sense of the word, it is the realization of a poet's dream castle. For he first bought a fisherman's cottage situated right by the sea, on the crest of the dune that the inhabitants of this Breton peninsula call the Lion of Touringe. With the help of a friend, an artillery officer, he then drew up plans for a manor house with 8 towers, the center of which was to be the house he had just bought. An architect modified somewhat this poetic project, and a manor with the cottage heart was built. One day, Theophile Bryant recalls, to synthesize the little Camaret Peninsula for me, Saint-Pol took a sheet of paper and drew a stone pyramid showing the hatchings of the wind and the roll of the sea. Underneath it, he wrote, Camaret is a stone in the wind of Malaya. A few pages back, we discussed poems that sing of breath and wind houses, poems with which we seem to have attained the ultimate degree of metaphor. And here we see a poet who follows the working draft of these metaphors to build his house. We should find ourselves indulging in similar daydreams if we started musing under the cone-shaped roof of a windmill. We should sense its terrestrial nature and imagine it to be a primitive hut stuck together with mud firmly set on the ground in order to resist the wind. Then, in an immense synthesis, we should dream at the same time of a winged house that winds at the slightest breeze and refines the energies of the wind. Millers who are wind thieves make good flour from storms. In the second tale in Treize, Saint-Pol tells how he lived a peasant's life at the same time that he was lord of the Hameret manor. Never, perhaps, have the dialectics of cottage and manor been so simply or so powerfully inverted as here. As I stand riveted to the first steps of the perron by my hobnailed boots, I hesitate to emerge suddenly from my rustic chrysalis in the role of lord. And further on, he writes, my flexible nature adapts itself easily to this equal's well-being, high above town and sea, a well-being in which my imagination loses no time conferring supremacy upon me over elements and persons. And soon, bound up in my egoism, I forget, upstart peasant that I am, that the original reason for the manor house was, through antithesis, to enable me to really see the cottage. The word chrysalis alone is an unmistakable indication that here two dreams are joined together, dreams that bespeak both the repose and the flight of being, evening's crystallization and wings that open to the light. In the body of the winged manor which dominates both town and sea, man and the universe, he retained a cottage chrysalis in order to be able to hide alone in complete repose. Referring to the work of the Brazilian philosopher Lucio Alberto Pinheiro dos Santos, I once said that by examining the rhythms of life in detail, by descending from the great rhythms forced upon us by the universe to the finer rhythms that play upon man's most exquisite sensibilities, it would be possible to work out a rhythm analysis that would tend to reconcile and lighten the ambivalences that psychoanalysts find in the disturbed psyche. But if what poets say is true, alternating daydreams cease to be rivals. The two extreme realities of cottage and manor, to be found in the case of Saint-Pol, take into account our need for retreat and expansion, for simplicity and magnificence. For here we experience a rhythm analysis of the function of inhabiting. To sleep well, we do not need to sleep in a large room, and to work well, we do not have to work in a den, but to dream of a poem, then write it. But to dream of a poem, then write it. We need both. It is the creative psyche. It is the creative psyche that benefits from rhythm analysis. Thus, the dream house must possess every virtue. However spacious, it must also be cottage, a dovecote, a nest, chrysalis. Intimacy needs the heart of a nest. Erasmus, his biographer tells us, was long in finding a nook in his fine house in which he could put his little body with safety. He ended by confining himself to one room until he could breathe the parched air that was necessary to him. And how many dreamers look everywhere in their house or in their room for the garment that suits them. But I repeat, nest, chrysalis and garment only constitute one moment of a dwelling place. The more concentrated the repose, the more hermetic the chrysalis, the more the being that emerges from it is a being from elsewhere, the greater is his expansion. And in my opinion, as the reader goes from one poet to the other, he is made more dynamic by his reader's imagination if he listens to Scrovelier, inviting the entire universe to come back into the house through all the wide open doors and windows. Toutes les chiffres, les beaux, les varies ou l'air, après entre ces muses qui croyant former un chambre, en clovès cravillès qui traversaient les mers. Je n'ai qu'un trop tout seul, vous aurez de la place. All that makes the woods, the rivers, or the air has its place between these walls, which believe they close a room. Make haste, ye gentlemen, who ride across the seas. I have but one roof from heaven. There will be room for you. The house welcome is so genuine that even what may be seen from the windows belongs to it. La robe de la montagne l'hésité à ma fenêtre. Jamais pu on entre silence et la montagne. Silence est une hauteur avec roche caillou. Un morceau de la terre altéré par l'essai. The body of the mountain hesitates before my window. How can one enter if one is the mountain? If one is tall with boulders and stones, a piece of earth altered by sky. When we have been made aware of a rhythm analysis by moving from a concentrated to an expanded house, the oscillations reverberate and grow louder. Like Spruvelier, great dreamers profess intimacy with the world. They learn this intimacy, however, meditating on the house. 9. Supervilli's house is a house that is eager to see, one for which seeing is having. It both sees the world and has it. But like a greedy child, its eyes are bigger than its stomach. It has furnished us with one of those exaggerated images that a philosopher of the image it has furnished us with one of those exaggerated images that has philosopher of the imagination that a philosopher of the imagination is obliged to note right away with a reasonably critical smile. Nine, Supervilli's house is a house that is eager to see, one for which seeing is having. It both sees the world and has it. But like a greedy child, its eyes are bigger than its stomach. It has furnished us with one of those exaggerated images that a philosopher of the imagination is obliged to note right away with a reasonably critical smile. But after this holiday of the imagination, we shall have to return to reality in order to speak of daydreams that accompany household activities. For they keep vigilant watch over the house. They link its immediate past to its immediate future. They are what maintains it in the security of being But how can housework be made into a creative activity? The minute we apply a glimmer of consciousness to a mechanical gesture or practice phenomenology while polishing a piece of old furniture, we sense new impressions come into being beneath this similar domestic duty. For consciousness rejuvenates everything, giving a quality of beginning to the most everyday actions. It even dominates memory. How wonderful it is to really become once more the inventor of a mechanical action. And so when a poet rubs a piece of furniture, even vicariously, when he puts a little fragrant wax on his table with the wooden cloth that lends warmth to everything it touches, he creates a new object. He increases the object's human dignity. He registers this object officially as a member of the human household. Henry Bosco once wrote, "The soft wax entered into the polished substance under the pressure of hands, and the effective warmth of a woolen cloth. Slowly the tray took on a dull luster. It was as though the radiance induced by magnetic rubbing emanated from the 100-year-old sapwood, from the very heart of the dead tree, and spread gradually in the form of light over the tray. The old fingers possessed of every virtue. The broad palm drew from the solid block with its inanimate fibers the latent powers of life itself. This was creation of an object, a real act of faith taking place before my enchanted eyes." Objects that are cherished in this way really are born of an intimate light, and they attain to a higher degree of reality than different objects or those that are defined by geometric reality, for they produce a new reality of being, and they take their place not only in an order, but in a community of order. From one object in a room to another, housewifely care weaves and ties that unite a very ancient past to the new epoch. The housewife awakens furniture that was asleep. If we attain to the limit at which dream becomes exaggerated, we experience a sort of consciousness of constructing the house and the very pains we take to keep it alive, to give it all its essential clarity. A house that shines from the care it receives appears to have been rebuilt from the inside. It is as though it were new inside. In the intimate harmony of walls and furniture, it may be said that we become conscious of a house that is built by women, since men only know how to build a house from the outside, and they know little or nothing of the wax civilization. No one has written better of this integration of reverie into work, of our vastest dreams into the humblest of occupations, than Henry Bosco in his description of the old faithful servant Stony. This vocation for happiness, so far from prejudicing her practical life, nurtured its action when she washed a sheet or a tablecloth, when she polished a brass candlestick. The little movements of joy mounted from the depths of her heart, enlivening her household tasks. She did not wait to finish these tasks before withdrawing into herself. where she could contemplate to her heart's content the supernatural images that dwelt there. Indeed, figures from this land appeared to her familiarly. However commonplace the work she was doing, and without in the least seeming to dream, she washed, dusted, and swept in the company of angels. I once read an Italian novel in which there was a street sweeper who swung his broom with the majestic gesture of a reaper. In his daydream, he was reaping an imaginary field on the asphalt, a wide field in the real nature in which he recaptured his youth and the noble calling of reaper under the rising sun. We should need, then, purer reagents than those of psychoanalysis to determine the composition of a poetic image. The fine determinations required by poetry bring us into the field of microchemistry, and a reagent that had been adulterated by the ready-made interpretations of a psychoanalysis, of a psychoanalyst, could cloud the solution. We should need then pure reagents. We should need then purer reagents than those of psychoanalysis to determine the composition of a poetic image. The fine determinations required by poetry bring us into the field of microchemistry, and a reagent that had been adulterated by the ready-made interpretations of a psychoanalyst could cloud the solution. No phenomenologist reliving Spolier's invitation to the mountains to come in through the window would see in it a sexual monstrosity. This is rather the poetic phenomenon of pure liberation, of absolute sublimation. The image is no longer under the domination of things, nor is it subject to the pressures of the unconscious. It floats and soars, immense, in the free atmosphere of a great poem. Through the poet's window, the house converses about immensity with the world. And as metaphysicians would say, it too, the house of men, opens its doors to the world. In the same way, the phenomenologist who follows women's construction of the house through daily polishing must go beyond the psychoanalyst's interpretations. I myself held to these interpretations in some of my earlier books, but I now believe that we can go deeper, that we can sense how a human being can devote himself to things and make them his own by perfecting their beauty. A little more beautiful, and we have something quite different. Here we have the paradox of an incipient, of a very customary action. Through housewifely care, a house recovers not so much its originality as its origin. And what a great life it would be if every morning every object in the house could be made anew by our hands, could issue from our hands. In a letter to his brother Theo, Vincent van Gogh tells him that we should go retain something of the original character of a Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe. Make and remake everything oneself. Make a supplementary gesture. toward each object give another facet to the polished reflections, all of which are so many booms the imagination confers upon us by making us aware of the houses in a growth. To have an active day, I keep saying to myself, every morning I must give a thought to St. Robinson. When a dreamer can reconstruct the world from an object that he transforms magically through his care of it, we become convinced that everything in the life of a poet is germinal. The following long fragment by Rilke, in spite of a certain overloading, gloves and costumes, gives us a feeling of naive simplicity. In Letters à musiciens, musiciens, in Letters à musiciens, Rilke writes to Benvenuta, Benvenuta. Rilke writes to Benvenuta that in the absence of his cleaning woman, he had been polishing his furniture. I was, as I said, magnificently alone when suddenly I was seized by my own passion. I should say that this was undoubtedly my greatest childhood passion, as well as my first contact with music, since our little piano fell under my jurisdiction as duster. It was, in fact, one of the few objects that lent itself willingly to this operation and gave no sign of boredom. On the contrary, under my zealous dustcloth, it suddenly started to purr mechanically, and its fine, deep black surface became more and more beautiful. When you've been through this, there's little you don't know. I was quite proud, if only of my indispensable costume, which consisted of a big apron and little washable suede gloves to protect one's dainty hands. Politeness tinged with mischief was my reaction to the friendliness of these objects, which seemed happy to be so well treated, so meticulously renovated. And even today, I must confess that while everything about me grew brighter and the immense black surface of my work table, which dominated its surroundings, became newly aware somehow of the size of the room, reflecting it more and more clearly, pale, gray, and almost square. Yes, well, yes, I felt moved as though something were happening, something, to tell the truth, which was not purely superficial but immense, and which touched my very soul. Was an emperor washing the feet of the poor, or Saint Bonaventure washing dishes in his convent. Benvenuto's comment on these episodes Benvenuto's comment on these episodes detracts from their charm somewhat when she tells us that Rilke's mother, while he was still a mere child, forced him to dust the furniture and perform other household tasks. But one cannot help sensing the nostalgia for work that emanates from this fragment by Rilke, or realizing that this is a culmination of psychological documents from different mental ages, since to the joy of helping his mother is added the glory of being one of the great of the earth, washing the feet of the poor. The whole thing is a complex of sentiments, with its association of politeness and mischief, of humility and action. Then, too, there is the striking line with which it opens. I was magnificently alone. Alone, as we are at the origin of all real action, that we are not obliged to perform. The marvelous thing about easy actions is that they do, in fact, place us at the origin of action, removed from its context. This long passage seems to me to be a good test of the reader's interest. Some may disdain it or wonder that it should interest anyone, whereas to others it may seem alive, effective, and stimulating, since it offers each one of us a means of becoming aware of our room by strongly synthesizing everything that lives in it, every piece of furniture that wants to be friends. There is also the courage. There is also the courage of the writer who braves the kind of censorship that forbids insignificant confidences. But what a joy reading is when we recognize the importance of these insignificant things, when we can add our own personal daydreams to the insignificant recollections of the author, then insignificance becomes the sign of extreme sensitivity to the intimate meanings that establish spiritual understanding between writer and reader. And what charm it confers upon our memories to be able to say to ourselves that, except for the suede gloves, we have lived moments similar to those lived by Rilke. 10. All great simple images reveal a psychic state. The house, even more than the landscape, is a psychic state, and even when reproduced as it appears from the outside, it bespeaks intimacy. Psychologists generally, and Francois Minkowska in particular, together with those whom she has succeeded in interesting in the subject, have studied the drawings of houses made by children and even used them for testing. Indeed, house test has the advantage of welcoming spontaneity. For many children draw a house spontaneously while dreaming over their paper and pencil. To quote Anne Balif, asking a child to draw his house is asking him to reveal the deepest dream shelter he has found for his happiness. If he is happy, he will succeed in drawing a snug, protected house which is well built on deeply rooted foundations. It will have the right shape, and nearly always there will be some indication of its inner strength. In certain drawings, quite obviously, to quote Madame Balif, it is warm indoors, and there is a fire burning, such a big fire, in fact, that it can be seen coming out of the chimney. When the house is happy, soft smoke rises in gay rings above the roof. When the house is happy, soft smoke rises in gay rings above that roof. When the house is happy, soft smoke rises in gay rings above the roof. If the child is unhappy, however, the house bears traces of his distress. In this connection, I recall that Francois Minkowska organized an unusually moving exhibition of drawing by Polish and Jewish children who had suffered the cruelties of the German occupation during the last war. One child who had been hidden in a closet every time there was an alert continued to draw narrow, cold, closed houses long after those evil times were over. These are what Madame Minkowska calls motionless houses, houses that have become motionless in their rigidity. This rigidity and motionlessness are present in the smoke as well as in the window curtains. The surrounding trees are quite straight and give the impression of standing guard over the house. Madame Minkowska knows that a live house is not really motionless, that particularly it integrates the movements by means of which one accedes to the door. Thus, the path that leads to the house is often a climbing one. At times, even, it is inviting. In any case, it always possesses certain kinesthetic features. If we were making a test, we should say that the house has K. Often a simple detail suffices for Madame Minkowska, a distinguished psychologist, to recognize the way the house functions. In one house, drawn by an 8-year-old child, she notes that there is a knob on the door. People go in the house, they live there. It is not merely a constructed house, it is also a house that is lived in. Quite obviously, the doorknob has a functional significance. This is the kinesthetic sign, so frequently forgotten in the drawings of tense children. Naturally, too, the doorknob could hardly be drawn in scale with the house, its function taking precedence over any question of size, for it expresses the function of opening, and only a logical mind could object that it is used to close as well as to open the door. In the domain of values, on the other hand, a key closes more often than it opens, whereas the doorknob opens more often than it closes. And the gesture of closing is always sharper, firmer, briefer than that of opening. It is by weighing such fine points as these that, like Françoise Minkowska, one becomes a psychologist of houses.